Hello, this is Thomas Carlo Bow, and I am pleased to be joined today by my friend and colleague, the composer and neuroscientist Dave Soldier. And we're going to talk a little bit about his music. As you know, if you're listening to this, he is almost like a composer in residence this summer at our performing arts space, and we're presenting piano music of his, some jazz tunes, as well as string quartets. Dave, welcome.
Buongiorno,
Boy,
Maestro Tommaso.
how did you come by your musical eclecticism? When did it start showing up? What were your first loves as a young boy musically, and how did let's go from there. Start give us a little background on your the fledgling musical life of Dave Soldier.
My first love, I mean, really love.
Yeah,
I'm not kidding. I am probably 5 years old or something. Was Gershwin's music
yeah,
because my father played it on records,
right.
and I always loved music, but that was I heard that and I couldn't believe it. It just was just so much more deep and meaningful. And also at the time, there was the heyday of rock and roll, but really for me, being in my generation, it was British rock and roll. So it was
Right.
the Stones and the Beatles and
Right.
blah blah blah, and all
Right.
that stuff. And Jimi Hendrix, who just when I heard him, just as they say, tore my head off.
Yeah.
So there was that happening, and then hearing the classical and the folk music. And my dad was not a musician, but he was a music lover, and so he had a bunch of those records. So and yeah, I listened to Gershwin, listened to early jazz, like he loved the modern jazz quartet. So I grew up hearing not just the Grand Ole Opry country western that was around
Right.
me, small town Midwest, not just the Isaac Hayes and the you know people like the gospel music, the people like Ike and Tina Turner and all that stuff that were very big when I was a kid. But also hearing that East Coast, Alan Lomax, Lead Belly is really from Texas but moved to New York,
Right.
and all that stuff. And so I guess having all that different kinds of music and taking lessons in the public school, learning to play
Right.
Mozart and so on.
Right.
And
Right.
so all that stuff coming together. I grew up between
Right.
Chicago and Memphis on the Illinois Central, and the country singers would come in. So I heard when I
Right.
was very young, I'd hear Chet Atkins and I'd hear Muddy Waters, and and so I'd hear all this different stuff, and you just hear it all the time, one after another.
Right.
So that's how I grew up. That's
Right.
and when you write, whatever you write, you're writing what you hear,
Right.
right? And that's what I hear.
One of the things that happens when you get a score is you look at it and you go, "Oh, okay, yeah, yeah, this person's got it, this guy's got it, this gal's got it, whatever." And I was immediately struck by, I guess, what I would call the craft and the technical mastery of whatever score you turned out. And this was whether it was the clarity of the harmonies or all those things. Now, what I'm curious is that means there's a lot of hours spent in study, but you didn't do that in formal study. Where did that come from in your case? Did you, because if I were just looking at it as a classical musician purely, it would never occur to me there's anything other than an intensely and beautifully trained classical musician who knows how to put notes on a page. But your background did not necessarily provide you the obvious tools to achieve those things. How between the cracks did you do that? You radical autodidact you.
When I was in fourth grade in Carbondale, where I grew up, they didn't have the regular music teacher. They'd have the traveling music teacher and travel around Southern Illinois.
Right.
And I ended up playing the viola. And so if you do that, you learn classical music. And so a lot of it just came from being a player, from trying to play Bach and Mozart. And, Stravinsky was by far the most avant-garde thing I heard, because the newer music just didn't make it to small town mid-America. Now it does because of the internet, but back then, it didn't at all. And so you get a bit of craft just from that. But then when I was 17, I moved to Michigan, and I was already a fan of all sorts of wacky music. Well, it turned out that the composer from the Art Ensemble of Chicago, one of the composers, Roscoe Mitchell, was living on a farm outside of Lansing, Michigan, where I was living. And that was like, what the hell? Roscoe, who you would think must be living in New York City, it's like Ornette Coleman or something. He's living on a little farm. So somehow I got his phone number and asked him if I could take lessons with him. He said, what do you play? Because he's a wind player. Play violin. Well, I can't teach you violin. I said, I know, but you're a really good composer, and I'd like to study composition with you. So for a while, I would catch a ride out to his farm, and he would charge me $14 a lesson, but I didn't have $14 back then, which it sounds insane now, but it's true.
Right, of course.
And so I would I would prune his apple trees for a couple hours, because on the farm. And then I'd come in and he'd give me music lessons.
Right.
And so that was, I think about it, it's like, God, I was fortunate to meet Roscoe when I was 17, because he was the first real musician who practiced 3 hours a day and tried to analyze Bach and tried to analyze Charlie Parker and stuff like that. And I was just so happy to meet him. Is completely out of, now later he became a professor in different colleges, but at the time he wasn't. Right. So that was very, that was transformative to me.
And so I'm interested, your lessons at the price of apple pickings. Now, what did those specifically consist of? Like, what could you give us like a breakdown of what a lesson might have consisted of for you and what was asked of you?
With Roscoe Mitchell, what he had me do was we would play Bach pieces, him on the flute, because he's a good flute player, and me on the violin, and we'd go through the pieces and just try to examine how the different lines were working together and apart. Not so much on the what musicians call the counterpoint. No, sorry, I'm really saying that wrong. More on the counterpoint, but less on the things like the figured bass, the harmony, the stuff that you really need to know in order to write Baroque music. Right. So, but Roscoe would be like, okay, I'm going this way, you're going that way, then we're going to meet, then we're, and start noticing these things and thinking of how to handle individual lines. Right. I believe if you listen to Roscoe's music, which sounds nothing like Bach, nothing like Werner, nothing like me, but you would hear, if you listen on a deeper level, you probably would hear it. Right. Because they're just thinking about how the instruments can intertwine. Okay? Right. The people that were the greats of that period, like Mulhall, Richard Abrams, and Roscoe Mitchell and those, their exercise was to write a solo in the tradition of Charlie Parker. Right. So you'd have to write, it's like jazz musicians know this. You buy the transcriptions of Charlie Parker and you go through them and memorize and learn them. And the people that know how to play in that style have all done that to some extent. Right. And that's very common now in jazz to get transcription. Do the transcribing yourself as a student of jazz, right? You go right. And so what Roscoe Mitchell would do is he'd say, okay, take Donna Lee, classic Miles Davis tune that's uses the same harmonies as Back Home in Indiana. And write a Charlie Parker solo. And then I'd bring it in and he'd go that's nice. That works, but Bird would have never done that. There's a series of pieces you wrote for the really remarkable and deeply, deeply talented violinist Miranda Coxon. And you wrote them out of the flamenco influence and spirit and
style, and you wrote them for solo violin, but with the optional addition of rhythmic elements, and the two rhythmic elements being, I think, that you have a cajon player. I know, right?
Yeah. Jose Moreno.
Could you tell us how those pieces came around? And then we're going to listen to one of them. We're going to play a short piece, which is just fantastic. I love it. So where first of all, where did when you heard flamenco, what drew you into that world, and how did you then decide that what you wanted to write were pieces for solo violin?
I kind of fell in love with flamenco when I was in Spain, and I'd always heard it, especially Paco de Lucia and Sabicas, whose records I had even when I was a teenager. And I heard elements of flamenco in salsa music, especially Eddie Palmieri, Palmieri was the principal who, I never studied with him. I've only met him. I have friends who play in his band. He's, still around and very active. He's in his 80s, but he's still very active. And Palmieri made me want to be a composer. And he has flamenco in his music, even if he's not a flamenco musician himself. He's not. And so I was always attuned to it, but I never understood it, because for Americans, it's about the most foreign music there is that is from the West, because
right,
from Spain. And the way they perform in Spain too is they don't have a stage; they just sit at a table, like where everybody else is drinking sherry or whatever, and they just set up the guitar and they use they. Nobody could see this, but I'm banging on the table here with and that's how they keep time, by banging their fists on the table. Okay, so that just opened my eyes, and I said, now I get this. It's very deep. They're doing something Americans can't do. Maybe if you're a solo jazz piano player, you can do this, but just about nobody else can do this. You change the feeling of the music immediately at the drop of a hat,
right.
And you make it a whole different emotion.
Right.
And that was very, very strong to me. Right. That's how I fell in love with flamenco.
The immediacy of there not being any filter between you and the thing you feel. I think as a music and as an expression, flamenco has that very much. And
it's still that music, and it's very, very living music. In Spain, it's very, very alive music.
Right. So the piece we're about to play for the audience is
a dance called Bulería. So I do want to mention that all of this music was heavily edited with advice from Pedro Cortés, who lives in Jersey City, but is from a line of famous flamenco musicians. And he grew up with Paco, and Sabicas is sort of his godfather and so on. So he comes right out of that tradition, and of all the people that have learned to play authentic flamenco in the West here, outside of Spain,
right,
and so on, he might be about the central figure, I would say. So, and he writes and reads music, which is very rare for flamenco,
right,
extremely rare, and it was sort of like you were asking me about Roscoe, and Roscoe would say, Bird wouldn't do that. And I wrote these pieces, and Pedro would say, like, that phrase is wrong. Now, why is it wrong? It's very hard to say. Very hard to say. It's like you have to learn the language and find out what's right and wrong. At one point, I said to him, the way that Bach has his dances for solo violin, and also Bartók had similar suite of pieces, and Vianovsky had, and Paganini sort of. I said, I want to do my set of 6 dances, but I want them to use the forms from southern Spain. Yeah, Bach used forms from Spain, right? But he didn't use forms. But he didn't use forms of contemporary flamenco. So that's what I want to do.
Let's go right now and listen to this piece from the recording is available on your website of Miranda doing?
Oh well, it's you can hear it on Spotify, YouTube, any of the formats on the internet.
Yeah, so
The name of the record is Calo, Calo.
performed by the formidable Miranda Coxon. And you chose to write something on a text by Johannes Kepler, right?
That's right.
Now, could you? I mean, I think most people listening to this will know that Kepler is the great astronomer. But what text and why Kepler?
So Copernicus had come up with this idea that contrary to the church, that the planets move around the sun in circles. And I think he later retracted that, but the idea was, the horse was out of the barn. Now, Tycho Brahe did not believe that. He wanted, and Kepler moved to Prague to work under Tycho Brahe, who I think kind of idolized, right? Also, Tycho Brahe had great eyesight, and Kepler was very nearsighted. So Kepler could never be the astronomer that Tycho Brahe was.
Right.
But he was better at math.
Right.
And so Tycho said, I think what's really happening is the Earth is still in the middle, and the planets and the sun move around the Earth, but there's a problem there. The problem is, if I look at Mercury, it goes like this, and then it goes retrograde. So if you have astrology friends and they say, it's in retrograde, well, it's literally in retrograde. It's instead of moving this way, it moved that way. Well, you can't do that if you're moving in a circle around the Earth, right? It should never do that. Right. So Tycho came up with this idea. All right, they're moving around the Earth, but they're moving in their own circles as they're doing it. So you're moving this way, and now for a little bit, it's going backwards, and then it goes forwards again, and then it goes backwards again. That should explain it. And he gets sick, and he's on his deathbed, and he says, Johannes, please don't let my life have been in vain. Show them that the Earth, that the sun revolves around the Earth and the planets revolve around the Earth. Well, Kepler tries to do it for 20 years, and he just can't make it work. Then he goes back to Copernicus, and he says, let's have it move in circles. And then he says, that can't be right, because even though I know there's no air and therefore no sound in space, he already knew that, the planets would, if you took each circle and you stretched it out like a guitar string and plucked it, they would not be in tune. They wouldn't be in octaves, for instance, or any of the perfect intervals. And he said there's no way that the master artisan who designed our solar system would have the planets be out of tune. So he tried to figure out what that would be. And he eventually came up with, but if they move in an ellipse instead of a perfect circle, that's like taking your guitar string and making it tighter or looser, and you change the pitch. And then every once in a while, they play in tune. Okay? And he wrote a book about this called The Harmony of the Worlds. And so if you read this classic book by Kepler, it explains the whole Renaissance music system, and it explains the elliptical orbits. The elliptical orbits became the basis of Newton's theory. Newton figured out force and mass and gravity and acceleration because he was trying to go further with understanding why the planets moved in ellipses. So in a way, this book, The Harmony of the Worlds, although it kind of started as a way to derive music and to derive the movements of the planets, became the foundation of all contemporary technology. So at one point in the book, Kepler literally asks that a composer of his era write a motet based on many pages of what the rules of the solar system music ought to be. And although people have taken one of the figures and sort of made some kind of music, a little bit out of it, to my knowledge, nobody's really written the motet according to what Kepler wanted. And finally, we did it.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to do, right? Because not only you have to figure it all out, but you've got to they didn't use 12 equal tuning. He used what they call just intonation. And Ekmelis is probably the only choir. It's run by a fellow named Jeff Gavitt. And Jeff is very good at this sort of thing. For a choir that does repertoire, that can sing in this ancient intonation, is probably only Jeff's choir at Ekmelis. So I'm very gratified that I sent them the piece and they liked it and they recorded it.
If music had taken that as its primary, shall we say, default drive, what a different world we would live in musically.
There's 4 movements in the piece. For the text, he doesn't specify. Right. He says you can use any text. But in the last movement, the earth can only sing mi and fa because misery and famine is our lot in earth, which was sort of a joke, but also he kind of meant it. So he said you can use any text. So Kepler really liked a Greek poet named Proclus. And so I took the lyrics from Proclus, Hymn to the Sun, because this music is supposed to be heard as if you were sitting, you the listener, sitting in the sun, hearing the planets spin around you. Now, like I said, there's 4 movements, and the one that's closest to what I think Kepler wanted is the second movement, the one I think you're going to play. That one really sounds like Renaissance music on purpose, but it uses all of Kepler's rules to get there.
Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes.
Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Seirestium eteres Basileus Theopetheus oimes. Exitor en foibos, exitor en foibos, cum amarium floris voio genefles, Euras lega cum amarium floris voio genefles.
Thank you so much, Dave, for this.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you programmed this stuff. It's fantastic.
Right. And you can't be with us for the 2 string quartets on June 11th, but when Taka Kigawa, another wonderful pianist and colleague of ours, he's going to play a piece of yours on his piano recital on August 6th up here called Haleo, which has the influence, you said, of many of your jazz pianist heroes. You're going to be able to be here for that, right?
I believe so, yes.
I'm looking forward to it, but I'm really, really happy you could write this music for us this year and just be involved in general. Dave, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. So long now.